John letter. In America, we have a little expression. It's called the Dear John letter. And you can imagine the the husband coming home from work, and he finds this letter on the refrigerator, and it says, Dear John, I have left and you're never going to see me again. That's what a Dear John letter is. That means that the wife has abandoned her husband. She has left the marriage, she has left the house, and he is never going to see her again. So in that situation, where the unbeliever has completely abandoned the believer, and there's nothing that they can do to stop it, in that situation, the believer is free from that marriage. They are free from that original bond. And so once again, we need to ask why. Why is this an exception to, or why is this given as a reason that you can get a divorce? Is because once again, this other person has completely and utterly destroyed the covenant bond of marriage. They have utterly failed to be faithful to their spouse. And just as before, divorce is not possible without sin on the part of at least one of the people. And in this case, the one abandons the other, and that is sinful. That is breaking the covenant bond that exists between them. But the one who has been abandoned does not commit sin by divorcing the person who has abandoned them. So that brings us to another question. Is it okay to remarry after you've had a divorce? If your spouse has abandoned you, then Paul says that you are free. You are not a slave any longer, but you have been freed from the bonds of your original relationship. And the same applies to divorce when there is adultery. You are freed from the bonds of that first marriage as well, because you have done absolutely nothing wrong in divorcing that other person. They're the one that has done something wrong. And so God pronounces your part of that covenant to be fulfilled, and He frees you to marry again. However, no such freedom exists for someone who is getting divorced for the wrong reasons. No such freedom exists for someone who is getting divorced for the wrong reasons. In the situation in Matthew, the woman who is divorced is pronounced to be an adulteress when she remarries. The reason is this: the bonds of that original marriage still hold her. She is still considered by God to be married to that first husband. And so when she gets married again, then she is rightly called an adulteress. And that is a hard teaching, isn't it? You know how the disciples reacted when Jesus said this? The disciples understood exactly what Jesus was saying. They understood how hard these words were, and this is what they said. If such is the case of a man with a wife, it's better not to marry. If such is the case of a man with his wife, then it is better not to marry. They knew that Jesus was talking about marriage being a much more permanent bond than their society had taught them that it was. Their society, just like our society, would allow for divorce for pretty much any reason. Their society would say that it's okay to get a divorce if things don't work out. They would tell them that they should just go on with life and they should have better luck next time. You'll get married again, everything will be okay. But Jesus is very, very different. Jesus is saying that there is this bond that continues to exist in God's eyes, and the only exceptions are for a spouse whose partner has cheated on them, or when their partner has abandoned them. And if there is, in those cases, the person can be divorced with freedom, but no one else can. The person who has committed adultery or who has abandoned their spouse is still restrained by the original bond. People who divorce for any reason other than adultery and abandonment are also held by this original bond. So what are the other reasons you can get divorced besides these two? What are the other reasons? There are none.
That's right.
There are none. What if you don't really love that person anymore? It's not a reason to get a divorce according to Jesus.
Amen. Amen.
What if your husband beats you? It's not a reason. It's listed in the Bible.
Amen.
You want it to be, don't you? But it's not. It may be necessary for a woman to live apart from her husband for a time in order to fulfill the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. Let me explain what I mean. If there is a woman who genuinely has reason to fear for her life because her husband is beating her so hard, then it may be necessary for her to live apart from him for a little while in order to preserve her own life. But that's not a reason for divorce.
Amen.
That's not a reason that God has given us. And so the disciples saw clearly what so many of us absolutely refuse to see. Jesus is giving a very, very hard teaching on divorce. And they jump to a conclusion, which is pretty typical of the disciples, isn't it? And they say, well, if marriage is that serious, then shouldn't everyone just avoid being married? I mean, isn't it better just to say, no way, I'm not going to have anything to do with marriage? And it is serious business. It's something that should not be taken lightly. It's something that has lifelong importance. Marriage is good, but it's something that must be taken seriously. So let's say that you're talking with people who are considering getting married. And, I know that you guys in the military, especially with the positions that some of you guys are in, you have a tremendous amount of influence on some of these young 18 and 19-year-olds that are coming in. Some of you guys that are the respected people in your towns in Africa, you guys are going to have a tremendous amount of influence on the young people. How are you guys going to counsel young people who are considering getting married? One of the things you need to tell them is that marriage is beautiful. Marriage is something that was created by God for people's enjoyment. It's something that is created for a blessing for them. There is a whole book of the Bible, the Song of Solomon, that talks about the joys of marriage.
Amen.
But be warned, it's not something that you should take lightly. And you need to really understand how serious it is.
Amen.
That's how you guys need to counsel those young people. So, what if you are already married to an unbeliever? What if you're already married to an unbeliever? And Paul talks about this very specifically in the verses that we just read, but I'm going to read it again so that we'll have these verses fresh on our minds. 1 Corinthians 7:12-16. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife. The unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. And how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Okay. So Paul is dealing with this situation that would have been very, very important in this context. In this context, it would have been fairly common for a woman to become a Christian and her husband not become a Christian. There are lots of pressures on men at these times to participate in the trade guilds in their society, and that those trade guilds involve them worshiping foreign gods. And so the husband would have been pretty reluctant to embrace Christianity because he knew that he would be forced not to be an idolater. The wife is a little bit freer in these situations, and so it was fairly common for women to become Christians and not men.
Amen.
It's also a situation that is fairly common in our society today, isn't it? There are so many Okinawan